So hello and welcome back to the bunker. If you watched the video previous to this, you'll know there's lots of plans to dress this up accordingly, but less of that for the minute. Welcome to the introduction, or at least on my channel, of the Porsche 718 GT4. Now, some of you are probably thinking, quite rightly so, that I'm a little bit late to the party on this one. However, I haven't actually experienced it yet. Spent a decent amount of time with the previous gen GT4. Everything that I've read and watched and spoken to owners of these cars are raving about them, so I thought it would be a disservice not to share it with you guys. So anyway, on to the evolutions that Porsche have made to improve this car. I want to start with the rear, actually. So let's just start with the wing. 20% more downforce versus the previous generation car. But interestingly, the rear diffuser was inherited, not as part of the GT4 development program, but it actually came off the back of the 718 Spider, which simultaneously launched at the same time as this car. Now, the reason being, because this has a large wing on it, you can obviously generate a significant degree of downforce from the wing, but on the Spider, there was no wing application at all. So what Porsche had to do was re-engineer the ground effect, the airflow from front to rear, and the rear diffuser on the Spider in order to create a little bit more downforce or ground effect. Turns out it was so effective that Porsche took the learnings from that car and fitted it to the GT4, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that it actually happened the other way round, but lo and behold, that was part of the development program of Spider. Now, while we're around the back of the car, we are appropriately positioned next to the exhausts. While we're here, I think we should talk about the fact that this is now subject, or some might say victim, to the fuel particulate filter. I actually haven't driven this car yet. You're not watching this in any particular order. Porsche dropped it off here, we parked it up. I'm giving you the walk and talk, and when we go out in a minute for a drive, it will be the very first time that I have experienced it. So we'll be sharing together how we think this thing sounds. But in terms of engine, from the previous gen, it was the 3.8 litre. This is now a specific GT developed engine. It's not what I would class as a thoroughbred GT engine. It's just that it has been bored up to 4 litres and it revs to 8,000 revs, but it has been developed by the GT department. It's just not quite as thoroughbred as that found in the GT3 engines, which is a sort of cup car race developed engine revving to 9,000 RPM. But again, we haven't driven it yet, so let's hold our opinions to the engines to ourselves for one moment. And then, sticking with the theme of aero and airflow, we shall introduce you to the front of the car. Now, a new introduction to the front bumper is what Porsche appropriately call air curtains. So these little black inserts here, these vents, on a lot of cars these days, the aesthetics are quite often for show, and what you might find is that they might be sort of blocked off or blanked out, but in true Porsche fashion, everything on the car not only looks great, but is a functional component too. The idea of this is that it channels air through the air intakes here and actually accelerates the airflow out through the front arch. What these actually double as is oftentimes, take for example the GT3 RS, on these arches here, they've got those sort of slatted vents. The idea is that at higher speed, you generate a high pressure environment within the wheel arch, which can generate lift. So the slots on a GT3 RS are designed to extract that air, and so are these air curtains here. And they also double as keeping the air flow close to the side of the car for improved aero. So yeah, functional and cool. And then round to the front, this is also another area where Porsche have found a great deal more downforce. If you compare this front splitter with that of the previous gen, it is dramatically deeper. These wheels are exclusive to this car. It's still following a very similar design language to a GT developed wheel, but it is new and exclusive to the GT4. They are shod in Michelin Pilot Sport Cup 2 extra sticky tires, which have actually been developed for this car. And then behind there, we have the optional carbon ceramic discs, and these are exactly the same discs that you will find on a GT3 RS. And then behind all of that, what you can't see is that the GT4 also shares the same suspension componentry from the GT3. So in a weird way, this is this sort of hybrid mixture of parts bin from GT3 and then specifically developed areas for GT4. It's very cool stuff. mildly revised interior. It's so beautiful, isn't it? Just as soon as you get into a Porsche, particularly with these 918 carbon bucket seats, just the driving position, everything about it just feels so right. It sort of hugs you. Now, I know this car's all about driving, but it is worth noting that this has the updated infotainment system. I think aesthetically it just looks better because the screen fits a lot more flush within the central console, but it also has programming for Apple CarPlay. And so when you do eventually get off the track and on a journey, you can plug in your Apple CarPlay and get the navigation benefits of Waze and things like that. Now, the all-important component of this car is, of course, this thing here. We have a 6-speed manual gearbox. I'll talk obviously more about how that feels and how you interact with it when we're driving. Porsche have gone and reworded a button. So in the previous gen, Auto Blip was called Sport Mode. So in order to turn on or turn off Auto Blip, which is effectively rev matching for you, so if you're not necessarily that au fait with heel and toe, the car can do it for you. So you can still enjoy what it's like to drive a manual car to about 60% of it, and then it will take care of the auto blip for you. But I think any self-respecting GT4 owner will be turning that off immediately because the whole point of this is those 3 pedals down there and this stick here, which I think is probably a good time to transition to track. Okay, so here we are. This is what it's all about, and lately the rain has been what it's all about as well. I know, look, if you watch this channel regularly, there's a joke between me and the audience that it's not really a Mr. JWW video unless it's raining. But today we've got the full force. I think we're actually filming at the tail end of what the UK is experiencing called Storm Dennis. There's gale force winds and floods going on around the country right now. So what better time than to film a car on track? Anyway, less of the weather, more of the car. This is what it's all about. I mean, immediately when I'm in the really fortunate position that I daily drive a Porsche GT3, and I've only had to drive up 100 yards to pick up on the difference in chassis balance and weight distribution. Having that engine moved to a truly mid-mounted slot is just such a beautiful experience, but it's still quite strange being in an interior that is essentially pretty similar to the GT3, but having an engine tone and a chassis balance which is so totally unique to itself. Oh, it's so slippery. It's so slippery. But that's prompted me. The way that this chassis breaks loose, it's very predictable. It's not snappy. You know, the physics of a 911 GT3, because the engine is so far back, if you have any sort of throttle lift mid-corner or when it does break loose, because all of that engine is so far back, when it lets go, it really lets go. This is very progressive and nice to counteract when it does snap. The first and last car which I drove on our circuit was actually the Koenigsegg Regera. There was a 1500 horsepower hypercar, and this track barely had enough sort of length in it to get enough air in its lungs to get going. This car, well, just listen to it. It's almost like it was made for tighter circuits like this. Now, our circuit is actually quite good because despite the fact that it's actually quite a short circuit, the surface, as I'm sure you can tell by the camera, isn't perfect. And as much as it pains me to say this, it's actually a little bit closer in character to what our British B roads are like. By no stretch are they perfect, but they're very much like this track. So it's a really good place to get a feel for the damping, the suspension, the way this thing handles across potholes and various lumps and bumps. Oh, it's just such a nimble, agile little car. The way it breaks loose, it's really predictable, and even over the curbs here, it absorbs them really well. So, engine. This is a bespoke GT division developed engine. Spored out to 4 litre. It's running 414 horsepower. revs out to 8,000 RPM, and it's connected to a wonderful short throw manual 6-speed gearbox. Now, when you, I love that corner. The way this car changes angle as well, it changes direction so well, despite the fact that these tires, you know, strictly they're not a wet tire, these Michelin Pilot Sport Cup 2s, but even in this weather, with not a great deal of heat, and when I say not a great deal of heat, absolutely no heat at all in them, the front end still turns in wonderfully well. That was the sound of it breaking traction and spinning up, and the pedal placement is absolutely gorgeous. The way that this thing, you can just roll your foot over on that throttle pedal under braking and match the engine speed with the transmission speed beautifully. Now, earlier on when we were having a walk and talk around this car, I was talking about the auto blip function. So I'll just give you a quick example of what that does. So with it engaged, it will effectively do the rev matching for you. So if I downshift now, you should be able to hear it rev match for me. So that wasn't me, that was it. Now, sometimes if you're feeling lazy or you haven't quite mastered the skill of heel and toe, it's actually quite a nice feature. But the whole point of this car and the way that it was engineered and developed is all about that extra level of interaction between car and driver. And while it's very impressive how that auto blip function works, honestly, most of the time, you're gonna wanna drive this with it off because it's all about the interaction between you and this fabulous box. Now, one of the criticisms of the first generation GT4 was that the gearing was perhaps a little bit too long. One of my hopes for this car was that they were going to address that and make the gearing in it a little bit shorter, so the acceleration was a little bit more punchy and you didn't have to work the accelerator quite as hard, and you got the opportunity to work the gearbox a little bit harder. But in this, because this car is slightly more mass produced than something like a GT3, it's actually something Porsche have had to keep the same gear ratios to adhere to emissions rules. Imagine that. Emissions regulations getting in the way of gear ratios. It's the most bonkers thing. Now, on this circuit, because it is quite small, it's quite tight, I think I would actually quite like these gears to be slightly shorter, because truth be told, I could probably drive this whole track in just second and third, which doesn't give me a lot of opportunity to play with the box, which is what this car's all about, really. But when you do get the opportunity to stretch its legs, it's such a wonderful experience. Now, sound. I've been fortunate enough to spend some time in the Generation 1 GT4, and that sounded incredible. Even though the engine wasn't as sort of finely tuned as this, it still sounded good. And sadly, while up there in the higher revs, up towards 7.5, and ultimately 8,000 revs, it does still sound good. Sadly, that fuel particulate filter I'm finding has got in the way of it a little bit. But one thing which does set a spot of context is ultimately how this car is greater than the sum of its parts, is that around the Nurburgring, this car is an entire 10 seconds faster than the previous generation car. And I think if that doesn't tell you enough about the evolution of this car, I'm not sure what does. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. I shall see you next time. Ciao.